The word soccer is not an American invention. It is not some clumsy rebranding dreamed up in the United States to avoid confusion with American football. It was actually invented in England by British university students decades before the sport was even widely played in America at all. So if the word came from England, how did it end up branded as the embarrassing American outlier while the rest of the world calls the sport football? The answer takes us through Victorian slang, elite universities, and a slow, quiet divergence between two countries that once used the same word for the same game. This story matters because it reveals something deeper than just a naming dispute. It shows how language evolves differently across cultures, even when it starts from the exact same root. And it exposes a myth that has caused unnecessary tension between American and international sports fans for generations, each side assuming the other invented an inferior, incorrect term. To find where this really started, we have to travel back to England in the 1800s, a period when organized sports at British universities were an absolute mess of conflicting rules. Different schools played wildly different versions of football, some allowing players to carry the ball with their hands, others strictly forbidding it, and there was no standardized rule book connecting any of them. This confusion came to a head in 1863, when representatives from several London clubs and schools met to form the Football Association, creating a single, unified set of rules for the sport that forbade handling the ball, a version that would eventually become what the world now recognizes as soccer. Just 8 years later, in 1871, the clubs that preferred a version allowing players to carry the ball broke away entirely, forming the Rugby Football Union, giving that version of the game its own separate identity and name, rugby football. With two distinct sports now both technically falling under the umbrella term football, English students needed a quick way to tell them apart in casual conversation. This is where British university slang enters the story in a fascinating way. Oxford students in the 1880s had a widespread habit of taking common words and adding the suffix "er" to the end, creating informal nicknames for everything around them. Rugby football became shortened and slangified into rugger. Following that exact same pattern, association football, referring to the version played under the Football Association's rules, was shortened to ASOC and then playfully modified into soccer. This wasn't some obscure or accidental term. It was a deliberate popular piece of university slang, used comfortably by British students, players, and even newspapers for decades afterward. For nearly a century following its creation, the word soccer existed in England completely alongside the word football, with British people using both terms interchangeably depending on context, much the way Americans today might casually alternate between saying television and TV without anyone considering one term more correct than the other. English newspapers throughout the early and mid-1900s regularly used soccer in headlines and articles, and this was not viewed as an American term at all. It was simply British English. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a completely different sport was independently developing its own identity. American football, which had evolved out of rugby-style college games throughout the late 1800s, quickly became enormously popular at American universities, eventually overtaking the popularity of association football within the United States by the early 1900s, because American football had essentially claimed the word football for itself within American culture. Americans needed their own clear way to distinguish the two sports, and they simply adopted the same British slang term that English university students had already created decades earlier. This is the key twist in the story that most people never learn. Through the middle of the 20th century, soccer remained a completely normal, non-controversial term in Britain, still appearing regularly in British newspapers, magazines, and everyday conversation well into the 1960s and even 1970s. The shift away from the word did not happen overnight, and it was never officially banned or eliminated through any formal decision. Instead, it faded gradually, driven by a growing sense of cultural identity and pride surrounding the sport in Britain, especially as the game grew into a defining national institution throughout England, Scotland, and the rest of the footballing world. As the sport's popularity and cultural significance deepened throughout Europe and South America over the following decades, the term football became increasingly tied to national identity and tradition, while soccer started to feel, to British ears, like a foreign, distinctly American term, even though the word had originated in their own country all along. This growing cultural association reached a noticeable turning point by the 1980s and 1990s, when British attitudes toward the word soccer shifted from mild indifference into open rejection. Many British football fans began viewing the word as a symbol of unwanted American cultural influence creeping into their most cherished national sport, despite the historical irony that the word had been born from British university slang generations earlier. Meanwhile, in the United States, soccer remained the only practical option, since American football continued to dominate the cultural meaning of the word football throughout the country, leaving no realistic path for Americans to rename the sport. Even as international pressure and mild teasing about the term grew over time, other countries around the world took a similarly practical path depending on their own football culture. In countries like Canada, Australia, and Ireland, where other sports had already claimed the word football for different games, most notably Australian rules football and Gaelic football, the term soccer became widely adopted for exactly the same reason it stuck in America, simply as a clear, functional way to separate multiple different sports competing for the same word. The biggest challenge in this story was never really about accuracy or correctness at all, since both terms are historically legitimate. The real challenge has always been perception. The assumption on both sides of the Atlantic that the other country invented an incorrect or inferior term, when in reality, both football and soccer share the exact same British origin, simply diverging in popularity based on completely different domestic sporting landscapes. Overcoming this challenge has mostly come through education, as linguists, historians, and increasingly, internet-driven fact-checking have slowly chipped away at the myth, revealing to millions of surprised readers and viewers that England itself is responsible for a word many assumed was purely American slang. As global media, international tournaments and streaming platforms increasingly connect fans across different countries, awareness of this shared history has continued growing steadily. It has become increasingly common now for commentators, journalists, and even official football organizations to acknowledge the true British origins of the word soccer slowly softening. Decades of unnecessary tension between American fans and international fans who once assumed they were using fundamentally different, competing vocabularies rather than two branches of the exact same linguistic tree. Soccer remains firmly embedded in American, Canadian, and Australian English, while football continues to dominate in England and throughout most of the footballing world, each term serving its practical purpose within its own cultural context.